It is my pleasure to introduce Lina Reichenberg, who is visiting us from Chalmers, where she leads a number of projects on power system planning, decarbonization, and you'll hear more about what she does and what her group does as well, I think, from her. We have scheduled this until 12:30, so we will have 30 minutes for the presentation and 20 minutes for the Q&A. Lina has also said that she welcomes interruptions throughout the presentation, so we can have kind of continual discussion. And Lina, you have the floor.
Great, thank you. So nice to be here, and so nice that there are so many people here in the room, and well, also online, but even better here in the room. Okay, so I'm just going to be very brief about some of the stuff that we do in our group, and one of them is, part of what I'm going to talk about today is kind of part of this theme of global energy system. So we've done a paper on supergrid between Europe and China, among other things, and I'm hoping to develop this area and more. So all suggestions are welcome for future work or collaboration and such. Another thing that we've done and that we're also going to do more of is different aspects of biomass in the energy system, focusing mainly on Europe then. So we work now with this model called PIPSA that some of you might know about. It's a group in Berlin that has developed the model, but is now used worldwide more or less. So if you don't know about it, I suggest that you check it out. There's some really cool stuff that's done with that model. We've also have a project that I have just partly involved in, which tries to look at more, political or sociological, economic factors that determine wind deployment. So basically trying to answer the question, for two equally windy countries, why does one have a lot of wind power? Why doesn't the other one have that? And I've done some work on variable renewables in the electricity markets, and that's also like what I'm working with Emil is also part of that theme. And we also do hydropower. I have a PhD student who was here until this morning. She unfortunately had to go home. Hannah works with hydropower. With the ultimate goal of trying to integrate a more detailed representation of hydro into energy models. And I'm also starting up a project on resilient energy systems. So basically trying to take into account risks due to, global geopolitics or failures of different kind, and try to find an energy system design that's resilient under those, possible futures. Okay, now I'm done with the general picture of what we do. So today I'm going to talk about something that I've done together with Xiaoming Khan, Fredrik Hidelis, and David Daniels. And Xiaoming has, of course, done most of this work. So if you ask me about details, I may be able to answer, but I may also not be able to answer. Xiaoming is now a postdoc in our group, but this is something that he started doing during his PhD. So this is, we actually submitted this paper, so there's a draft on arXiv, but we got reject, but we also got some really good reviewer comments. So now we modified it, and that's what I'm going to try and present today. It's called Renewable Levelized Cost of Electricity Available for Export. So basically, it's a kind of indicator or an index that shows the potential for renewable export in the future energy system. So now this is the resource map of oil of today. So this shows that, you know, there are many countries in the world that have very little oil resources, and then there were a few, notably, here I singled out Venezuela, Saudi Arabia, Iraq. There are countries that have a lot of resources. And as we all know, that has created a certain geopolitical situation in terms of fossil fuel trade and also economic power that these countries exert over the rest of the world, basically. And this is a map of the oil imports. So these are the countries that import most of the oil today. It's the US and China. Here's another chart also showing the petroleum reserves. So these four countries, Saudi Arabia, Venezuela, Iran, and Iraq, they actually dominate, or they dominated the petroleum reserves. And they still do, but yeah, I mean, up until early 2000s. And this is Canada, so what happened here? Yes.
Shale.
Yes, shale. Oh, I already said it. Sorry. Yeah, shale oil. So this shows that, you know, and a technology, a new technology can change at least part of the situation when it comes to resources. But still, these very stable anti-democratic. Yep. So this is something that Irina produced. On the left-hand side is the trade, the present trade in different energy sources, fully dominated by oil. But this is, I mean, in terms of money, right? On the right-hand side is what Irina thinks is going to happen in 2050. And you can see that the green thing there is bioenergy. But there's also a fair amount of electricity or electricity-derived fuels. Again, I mean, this is what they think, and whether that be based on something realistic or not, I'm not to tell. But anyway, some people think this is going to happen. And there's, in fact, already hydrogen trade or planned hydrogen trade in the world, so like partnerships between different countries. And as you can see, they all they center in around Europe a lot and coming from different places in the world. So the research questions that we will try to at least partly answer in this work is to try and identify potential exporting countries, importing countries, so countries that have need of renewable fuels, and also those who are self-sufficient, so they can do with their own domestic resources. And the other thing, which is kind of a side note, but anyway, how does of course, the resource potential of, you know, wind, solar, hydropower, of course, matters for how cheaply you can make your own fuels domestically. But how does economics or the financial situation impact that cost? So I think we have basically two contributions. We have invented a simple metric that tries to capture competitiveness. And we've done that for all countries. So that metric includes both the renewable resource, it includes the financial situation, economic, it takes into account land availability for wind and solar, and also, well, I call it demographic factors, but it's basically the demand for electricity and sometimes hydrogen or other energy. And we validate that metric using a detailed energy system model, and we also do that for all countries in the world. So, I mean, this work is kind of in the same tradition as the resource potential tradition, and this is a map of the solar resource around the world. So it's simply solar irradiation, but it's probably what a PV would produce. So the capacity factor with PV had it been in this spot. And there's plenty of those studies, which you probably all know. And these are just two of them, but there are many others. And then there's the other strand of literature that is more like energy systems, which tries to build an energy system, a global energy system model, and run it the way we usually run those models. And so I also have two examples of that literature here. Christian Breyer is on this paper and some others on this issue. And we've also written a paper on that. So are people here familiar with, are you guys energy system modelers? So you know what I'm talking about. Please interrupt me if I'm unclear. In the field, if you want, that we're trying to make a contribution here, Irene actually has a few reports out on something similar, although they do more in a sense. They try to actually pinpoint trade routes, and they also take more things into account, like water scarcity, for instance. There's also, kind of unfortunately for us, a new paper out like last week by Ken Caldera's group that looks at something similar. And I haven't dived into this paper yet to see if hopefully we can still make a contribution even though they put this out. Okay, so now I'll get to the method, but like a question for you. I actually grappled with this question for a few years before starting this work. How would you represent with one number the renewable energy potential for a country? Any thoughts? Yeah.
Do you need to kind of think about, yes, you maybe have some good resource places, but maybe that is in vulnerable nature. So, and you have the area conflicts. Yeah. So you might have a really, really big potential. Let's say we have in Norway. Yeah. We have maybe like the biggest wind power opposition in Europe, maybe, but still we have really good resources. So I would kind of like separate between ideally we could get these resources, but unfortunately these best resources are in untouched nature, and some of these resources can create big conflict with the population and so on. Therefore I would say like conflict-free resources I would maybe separate. I don't know if that makes sense for you.
Yeah, that's definitely one aspect, and we tried to take that into account, or we took that into account using a proxy. So the proxy that we use is that we remove the land that's, natural reserves, basically, which is not all the land that you're talking about. And it's definitely not all the opposition that you're talking about. But then after we removed that land, we said, well, the remaining land, you can put X% wind and Y% solar. And we put those numbers to 10% and 5% respectively, which is, big or small. I don't know. I mean, you can argue for both that it's too much as well as too little. But we took it into account in some way.
So were you able to quantify that maybe the conflict-free places have not so good resources and maybe are more expensive, that you have an economic value on that?
Yeah, I mean, we also have, this is a global model and a global data set, so we have proxies for that if you want. I mean, we do have the wind and solar and hydropower resource potential. So in a way, we can see where it coincides. If a natural reserve coincides with good wind resources, that's remote. Or, well, the natural reserve is remote, and part of that land is with wind resources. Okay. But anyone else has an idea of how to collapse all these things into one number? Okay, I'll show what I tried to come up with. So this is what we did. One, we called it the RLCOEX. So LCOE because it has the same unit as LCOE, so US dollars per megawatt hour. It's something with the cost of electricity. R because it's renewable. X because it's for export. And we define export this way. So here is think of this as the supply curve for one country. Let's say Norway. Now we order all the resources after we remove land and so on. So here's wind, solar, and hydropower resources. And we order them from the cheapest to the most expensive. And then we find the place where, for the volume of the domestic demand. And that domestic demand we get from the SSP2 scenario from IPCC. So it's like a future demand that tries to predict the demand for 2050. Now, that number we call the RLCOEX. So that's the most expensive resource needed to supply domestic demand. And anything above that, we say can be exported. So that's also the marginal cost for the first unit of export. Yes, Lilian.
So in this curve, you have wind, solar, and hydro.
Yeah.
But not the biofuel.
No. Good. Thank you. No biomass, and it's only existing hydro. Okay. So we tried to find, and the LCOE that we assign to existing hydro is if we were to invest in that hydro again, so to speak, greenfield, then that hydro would have this LCOE. Because, I mean, in reality, existing hydro has an LCOE of almost zero, right? Because it's already invested in its sunk cost. But we treat it as though we had to invest in it again. Okay. And we use the data from our database and model that we published a paper on it in 2020, I think. That paper, Matsalita. So there we find the electricity demand, and we actually have not only the volume, but we also have the profile, and that's going to be important later on. Not now. I mean, for now, we only talk volume. And like I said, we remove some land, and of the remaining land, we say that 10% of that can be used for onshore wind and 5% for solar. In that model or data-driven base, there's an extra cost for remote sites. So trying to take into account that you have to build transmission in order to get that electricity to load centers. And And we use different, I mean, you can call it WACC. For us, it's like a discount rate. We use it as a discount rate for different countries. So we have a risk-free discount rate, which we set at 5%. And countries that we assign that risk-free discount rate are countries like, Germany, the US, many other countries. And then we get this country-specific hurdle rate from a paper by Damodaran in 2021. So that's an additional, we treat that as an additional discount rate. So that means that places like Somalia has a discount rate of 18%, for instance, and so on. So that's one of the metrics that we use. I'm probably going to talk more about this, mostly about that. But we also try to quantify the volume of the export below a certain cost threshold. So, this is the marginal cost for the first unit of electricity. So it's like a qualitative metric. However, this volume, if I say, so we often set this cost benchmark to $30 per megawatt hour, is a volume that you can produce for a cost below that threshold. And we call that something else, PEG. Does this make sense to you? So here's an example of a supply curve for Spain. So yeah, like before I showed the principle, and this is what it might look like in reality. So here, one means that is the demand for Spain. So Spain has enough renewable resources to supply its demand at a cost of, I don't know, $17 per megawatt hour. And doesn't that sound really cheap? No? Yeah, well, I mean, we took numbers from IRENA projections for 2050 or 60. And those are, I mean, in those projections, PV is really cheap. It's like, that's like 330 maybe US dollars per kilowatt, something like that. So, I mean, but that's, that's a choice that you can do differently if you would want to.
I have a question.
Yeah.
But does this computation also take into account the construction of the infrastructure, like the grid that is necessary to maintain such a production?
No. Very good question. And that's why you might question whether this is a good metric or not. But the thing is with the metric, what we're trying to do with the metric is identify countries which have a big, export potential. It's not necessarily to say, oh, country X can actually export hydrogen at a cost of.
This chart could induce into an error of evaluation the reader, like, oh, this is really cheap, but then it's not that cheap.
Yeah, you're right. So that's a very good point. But I'm going to show you later that we try and validate our ranking of countries using something that does take into account what you just said and other things too. Okay, so this was result, even though it says method. Now, here is our first result of the RLCOE X. And again, just to remind you, it's this number for all countries in the world. And actually, as you can see, some countries are merged, like the blue one there, which is probably the Benelux countries. And some countries are divided into regions, like the US, and China because they're so big. So most of them are, national borders, but not all of them. And the scale goes from 13 US dollars per megawatt hour. That's the RLCOE that the cheapest countries can, that they get. And it goes up to 50. So the darker the shade, the cheaper the renewable energy. And some countries or regions are not self-sufficient given our assumptions. And for instance, that's, as you can see here, it's Japan, South Korea, and that is only a region in China, so it doesn't mean that China is not self-sufficient, but it's only that region, Eastern China. And some countries have a very high RLCOE, so a very high cost of, well, given our assumptions again, above 200 US dollars per megawatt hour. For instance, the Benelux countries and part of Indonesia. Questions?
I have a question about this. Your assumption of self-sufficient is that you imagine like a world where nuclear energy would not have any role.
Yeah. Good question. So, what can these red or blue countries do? Now, one thing that they could do is to import from other countries. Another thing that they could do is, build nuclear so that they are now self-sufficient. So you can also interpret these as possible places where nuclear is really, it's probably a pretty cost-effective way to produce electricity and/or fuels. But you can also see that there are some countries. Remember now that which countries were the biggest importers of oil? You remember?
Saudi Arabia.
No, that's the biggest. Well, that's one of the biggest exporters.
US and China.
Yes, US and China. And as you can see here, they actually have excellent renewable resources and probably enough land. So they can now be, it turns out, they can be the world's largest exporters instead. Not only can they cover their domestic demand, they can also export a lot of low-cost renewable fuels or electricity. Yes?
How did you account for source variability wind and solar?
Yeah, I'll get to that together with your question. Yeah. Yeah. Yes. You, Jonas, or you?
Take first.
Okay. Now, also like resource use or like building out all this installed capacity.
Yeah. We haven't taken that into account. So that's a good question that we have not considered.
So you haven't kind of like compared mining with respect to, let's say, nuclear.
Yeah, good point, but no.
Are you kind of assuming like a copper plate that you have infinite export?
No.
The world is like a copper plate, or are you only thinking about fuels?
No, okay, so it's actually the opposite, that we're thinking about each of these regions as isolated. So they have to provide their own electricity, which I know is not the case. But we're like assuming that they have to provide their own, and then whatever excess that they can produce, they can export in one way or the other. So
within the regions.
No, to other regions. So they can either build transmission and sell their electricity, or they can make hydrogen or.
So you make no assumptions about like weather correlation that the export might have no value, or that you have to maybe make hydrogen or synthetic fuels. You make no assumptions about that.
No, you could look at this as the potential, not the way things are going to be. But this is like like a snapshot of something that tells you something about the potential. So it's an index, like what's been done before with resource potential studies, only it takes more things into account, in my view. But I think I'm going to skip some things. So this is basically the volume metric that I talked about before, which also shows that US and China, not only can they produce cheap electricity, but they also have a large potential to export a lot of it. So I'm going to skip this, and we can talk about it if we have time. So the pros of this metric is that it's really simple. It's available data. You can basically do it in your living room. You have a laptop. You don't need a model. And unlike other indices that I've seen papers on, like saying that, okay, so China gets a 5 in our index. Libya gets a 3. What does that tell me? It doesn't tell me that much. I think the unit of this, so US dollars per megawatt hour, does give you a hint of the quality. And like I said before, it integrates economic, political, demographic, and resource situation into one number. So you represent each country by only one number. But yeah, like you both have asked, why should we believe that this actually says something about country competitiveness when it comes to renewable energy? So what we try to do is to validate these numbers using a real energy system model that we developed before. And then it's just like what you usually do for energy system modeling, only you're not allowed to build transmission. So each country for itself, so to speak. Isolated borders. And we took out two measures to compare our metric to. One is the electricity cost and one is the hydrogen cost. And actually today I'm only going to talk about the hydrogen cost. So that includes the stuff that you asked about. So it includes having to build enough grid domestically, or actually not grid. No, there's a proxy for grid, sorry. There's a proxy cost for grid, and also other variation management costs, because, yeah, as you all know, even though the LCOE of wind and solar may be 20 or 30, but the system cost of a renewable energy system is, 70-ish US dollars per megawatt hour. So this method takes into account those things, but then we also add a hydrogen demand of 50% of the regular electricity demand. And we look at the correlation, between our metric and the cost for hydrogen. I'm going to skip this. We can look at it later. Or actually, maybe we should look at it. So this is the marginal hydrogen cost for the US. So now imagine we have the US, we have this energy system model that does everything that they usually do. We have added the hydrogen demand, it's flexible. And now we ask ourselves, so what's the cost of the first unit of hydrogen that we need on top of the electricity? The electricity demand has a profile, but the hydrogen demand, the way we model it, can be produced at any time. So it's very flexible. There's a demand over the year, but when it's produced, we don't care. So this is that marginal cost for the US. And as you can see here, the first unit is really cheap. Why is that? Yeah.
Because you have a lot of low price cannibalism, that you can try to increase the value of renewable energy by producing hydrogen.
Sure, that's one way of putting it. Another way of putting it is that the hydrogen production provides flexibility to the system. So it actually helps the system anymore. So it's really cheap in the beginning, but then I think the electricity demand now for the US is like 4,000, so 4 petawatt hours per year. So when we get to a hydrogen demand that is, you know, on the order of or approaching the total electricity demand, you don't get that marginal effect anymore. It costs much more. Then it flattens out. So now the figures that I'm gonna show you compares roughly this point when it starts to flatten out typically with our metric.
Still have a little problem like understanding like how it can be so low if you take into like all the cost of the electrolyzer infrastructure, the capex, the stack capex, the efficiency.
It's because of variability. So basically the first energy that you use to produce hydrogen, it's something that you would otherwise curtail, throw away. So that means electricity is, you know, at almost zero cost. Then you have to pay for the electrolyzer. So it's not zero, it's something. You have to pay for the electrolyzer to make the hydrogen.
Have you then thought about kind of the competitiveness of these providers of that energy in 2050 that might produce electricity very cheaply? Why are they interested in investing in it?
Yeah, I mean, by default, the system minimizes system cost. Theoretically,
you're not sure if someone would invest in it.
Well, if there's a perfect market, yes, I'm sure. But that's a much bigger discussion. I think we have to take that later. So here's the correlation between our metric here on the x-axis and the marginal cost of hydrogen. And again, by marginal here, I mean when you have to produce 50% of your domestic electricity demand as domestic hydrogen. So it's marginal in that sense. And we can see that...
Clarification.
Yes.
And that's based on a fuel cell burning the hydrogen or using the hydrogen that you've produced with electrolysis?
No, it's only the electrolyzer. It's not coming back to electricity. So this is the cost. I mean, hydrogen cost is sometimes expressed as cost per kilo, but here is per megawatt hour in order to be able to compare them.
The megawatt hour is the consumption of electricity that goes into the electrolysis.
Well, I mean, there's an efficiency loss when going from electricity to.
Right. Thanks.
But anyway, we see quite good correlation between our metric and what it actually costs to produce hydrogen for export. So all of your questions, which were really good questions that also our reviewers had, it turns out that it still seems like it's a pretty good metric, even though this number was found using something really complicated. This number was found using something very, very simple. I mean, not everyone has access to an energy system model, and even fewer want to run it for all countries in the world. And there are a few outliers here. What are these, do you think? What kind of countries are those? You want to guess?
Yeah. Not self-producing.
Sorry?
Not self-producing.
No, I mean, you're right. They're red, so they look like the non-self-sufficient ones. Sorry about that. but this is different. Yeah, you wanna?
Much better water availability than other countries.
Yeah, you are right. So these are actually hydropower countries, countries with lots of hydropower resources, even more than they need for themselves. One of them is Laos, I think, and the other one is something else I forgot. And yeah, here's a validation of the other metric that I talked about, the volume metric. So it has actually an even better fit. And here's the same one that I showed in the beginning, but here we have double the hydrogen demand. So instead of being the marginal cost at the 50% domestic hydrogen demand, it's at the 100% domestic hydrogen demand. And as you can see, it has an even better fit. And yeah, I think I'm actually gonna stop there. And then it's better that you ask me things and maybe I will put up a slide.
Thanks.